Hello and welcome to the EOA's Introduction to Employee Ownership webinar. I'm Yogi Johnston, your host for today. This 90-minute webinar is all about employee ownership, getting the key learnings and best practice approaches on how to move to employee ownership, hearing from a case study about a business who's already been through that transition. So hopefully you'll go away today with some really good learning. For those that are new to the EOA, our virtual network meetings are typically split into three parts. We have three guest speakers for you today that will share their insight and experiences. You'll then have the opportunity to have a Q&A session with them. And then after that, you'll be moved into a networking space, a virtual networking space, where you'll have the opportunity to have an informal chat with them, ask them some more questions, and as well as talk to the rest of the EOA team and some of our supporter members as well. So the EOA, we support business owners in their journey in exploring if employee ownership is right for their business. And if it is right for their business, we'll connect you to other members within the EOA sector to get their experience in terms of what they did well, what they wish they'd done differently, which is always great. We also connect individuals to professional advisors to help them on their journey towards employee ownership. And if employee ownership is right for your business and you're moving towards that space, one of the things that we talk about really is implementing good employee ownership for our businesses to really help them businesses thrive and succeed. And we do that through a few different ways. The first of which is holding more sessions like this. So we have face-to-face and virtual network meetings on a regular basis where you can talk to other members, as well as you'll see we have our in-person conference. This is an annual event and it's a great opportunity to actually meet the EO sector, see how big it is, but also take away some great learning and sharing of experience and connecting with others as well. And the other thing that we do to help our members really is have what we call our online networking platform, the EO Hub. Again, you'll meet people, you connect with them, but our online networking platform is there to again connect with people. But actually, if you've got questions, we've got a forum that you can go and ask other people that have had similar experiences. And also, one of the really popular areas is our resources, and that resources section has recordings of all of these webinars on there, and any really good examples of things that other businesses have done that you can actually take rather than having to reinvent the wheel. So really good opportunity to actually learn and make sure you're doing things the right way. And as well as that, we also have our EO Learn training courses. So, as I mentioned, we're all about making sure businesses have good employee ownership. And good employee ownership for us is good governance, good leadership, and good employee comms and engagement. And our courses are tailored towards that. It's around making sure you've got the right skills, knowledge, and experience to go ahead and become a thriving employee-owned business. For example, we've got a course which is all about your employee trustees. So one of the key governance elements in becoming an employee-owned business is having that employee voice. And this course is a virtual course and it helps you really get under the skin of that role, which means that the individual doing that role goes away with the skills and confidence to be able to do that role. So do please take a look at some of our upcoming events as well as our courses as well. And if you're not an employee ownership association member at the moment, don't worry. After this webinar, you will have the opportunity to potentially talk to one of our membership execs about membership options and really explore whether a membership to us might be the right thing for you as well. So, if you do become employee owned, fantastic. We have what we call EO Day every single year, which is this opportunity to really celebrate employee ownership in all of its guises. One of the things that we absolutely believe in is that employee ownership helps unlock the potential in the people that work in an organization, the organization itself, and the economy. And EO Day really is that opportunity to shout about employee ownership and make sure that the wider community knows the impact an EO effect on a business. And that's our theme for this year, the EO effect. So I hope you connect into our social channels and help us celebrate EO Day this year. So I'd like to now move us on to our session for today. As I mentioned, we've got 3 speakers. We will be hearing from Richard Cowley, who's Director at RM2. RM2 is a specialist employee share scheme and employee ownership trust advisor. And Richard will be talking about the technical considerations in becoming employee owned today. We'll then hear from Giles Sirett, who is CEO at ShapeBlue. Giles will give you an honest account of their journey and how their colleagues were involved in different extents at different stages of the EO transition. And then we will hear from Dan Sawyer, who's Executive Director at London and Capital. London and Capital build investment strategies that are designed to be resilient and help clients achieve their long-term financial goals. Dan will be talking about insights into wealth management. Now, I mentioned after our 3 guest speakers share with us their insights, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session. So please do add in your questions into the Q&A function that you'll see on the right of the screen. If someone's already asked a question that you wanted to ask, upvote it. So click the upvote button. That tells me that that question is really important, and I'll make sure that it gets asked as well. And so our Q&A session is about 20 minutes long once we've heard from our speakers. So about 5 to 12-ish, we'll move you then into our networking area. As I said, this is an opportunity to really talk informally, one-to-one with each of our guest speakers. And then we'll bring you back into the session about 12:30-ish, just before, to do a bit of a wrap-up, get your feedback before ending the session. So I really hope you enjoyed today's session. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Richard onto stage.
Hello.
Hi, Richard. Over to you.
Excellent. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I have a problem. I can't see the document that I need to share. Yogi, are we able to do the sort of contingency where I kind of just you put up my slides, please? Hello? Thank you very much. Can we go to the next page, please? So just quickly introduce ourselves. So RM2, we advise on employee ownership, all things employee ownership. We've been doing that for the last 25 years. We are also employee owned, transitioned over around about 4 years ago, and we're in the happy position that we have no deferred consideration to pay anymore, and we are into pure profit share. Our experience of employee ownership to date has been overwhelmingly positive, but I'd be lying to you if I said there wasn't a few bumps in the road, but we kind of have learned as we've gone along, and it's been very good for the company. We have done many EOT transactions. We've pretty much seen all scenarios. We can advise in accountancy, legal, tax, funding, role of trustees, and anything else you can think of. However, for this session, I've got very limited time, so I'm going to try and talk about things which I think would be very practical for people considering doing and becoming employee owned. So the first one is why sell to an EOT? Effectively, the headline benefit is that you can sell your business tax-free. Our experience is that comes some way down the list of factors for why people sell their business to EOTs. For the owners, you can pretty much summarize the benefits is that they don't have to sell their business to a third party. So you don't have to find that third party, you don't have to go through an extended period of negotiation, due diligence, and potentially have to sell your business to somebody you've fallen out with. The thing to take away from this that an EOT transaction, really it is very much a seller-controlled process. You may want to involve your colleagues in the process, most do, but ultimately decisions which are made by the sellers. From the point of view of your colleagues, it's also very positive because it's a very gentle transaction. You can have it, so once you get your head around the fact that you are selling your business to a trust, the actual process of selling the business is far more simple and far more straightforward than selling it to a third party. Also, the business after the transaction can be exactly the same as the business before the transaction. It means that you can change your business in order to get that sort of employee engagement at a speed that suits the business and suits the owners and suits the colleagues. There is no rationalization that you could have if you had a third-party transaction. Plus, immediately after the transaction, your colleagues can get paid an element tax-free, $3,600 immediately afterwards. And there's the promise of a profit share, albeit after a period of time, probably while the owners are being paid. There is the opportunity, as a characteristic of EOT transaction, it allows you to incentivize, motivate key staff by allowing them to buy shares directly in the business. I will get into a bit more detail about that later. Can we move on? Key point to consider is obviously the valuation and price, and to get your head around that. You sell your business to a third party, you've got the discipline of the value of your business is effectively what somebody is prepared to pay for you. That doesn't exist in an EOT transaction. The trustees can only pay a fair value in the business, and they rely on a valuation in order to arrive at that fair value. However, valuations are incredibly subjective. If you ask your valuer for a very optimistic valuation, you will get a much higher price than a prudent valuation. We suggest and we advocate bearing in mind that actually, from an EOT point of view, the value of your business is what the business can afford to pay for itself over a reasonable period of time. And we consider a reasonable period of time to generally be 5 or 6 years. It can be longer given the circumstances for a business, but I think if you get up to sort of 10 years, you're really pushing the envelope, and we so wonder whether it's questionable that trustees may not agree to a repayment schedule at that time. Plus, we think it kind of gives you scope to be challenged by HMRC in terms of the valuation. Something to bear in mind. Next slide, please. Very important, when you're doing an EOT transaction, you can get very caught up in the transaction process yourself. It is very helpful to have a vision for where the business is going to be after the transaction, after deferred consideration is paid, potentially after the owners have exited. If you get a vision for that, it means you can tweak your EOT transaction in order to facilitate the business moving to that next level. You will need a succession plan. It is very important. You actually don't need it at the point the transaction takes place, because there's probably going to be a period over which the owners stay within the business while they're paid, and therefore there is time to put that succession plan together. But you will need a succession plan. You should consider how you're going to incentivize your key staff, the next generation of directors in the business. Again, there are particular characteristics of EOT transactions which allows very beneficial motivation to be done, and we will touch into that later. But you also should bear in mind it's more difficult about how you incentivize your rank and file. Yes, you have the ability to pay them tax-free immediately, but you have this period before it actually goes to profit share. And how you kind of inform your staff is important. It leads you into be very considered about how you talk about the transaction to your colleagues. Yes, be very considered about how you talk to your colleagues around the transaction. You are putting a change process in place. You are probably putting a flag in that you will be exiting at some point in time. Be expecting the unexpected questions from your colleagues. Next point. Funding. The vast majority of transactions are funded by the vendors themselves. Effectively, they lend the money to the trust to buy their shares. Third-party funding is available. It reduces the risk for the vendors because they get paid slightly quicker. Do not take that decision lightly to move to third-party funding. It means that you will fundamentally change the nature of the transaction because you are bringing a third party into that transaction. Plus, don't even consider it unless your business is producing already £1 million plus profit consistently every year. It is an expensive process. So in order to get the funding in place, you'll need a commitment fee, you'll have legal fees, due diligence fees, you may pay an advisor. £150,000 to £200,000 would be very realistic costs for actually moving in. Interest rates at the moment, the best you could get is around about 8%. They will go up if base rates go up, they will go down if base rates go down, but it will be quite a drain on the process. The most you can borrow is probably about 2.5 times EBITDA, so there will still be vendor debt behind it, bear in mind. One very important factor, you are bringing a real lender into the business. It's not like vendor debt. Your colleagues, your next generation of directors may not thank you for bringing such a large amount of debt into the business, which needs to be serviced. Next one, please. So it's always a question of how much you're going to sell. So you got the pure EOT model that you sell 100% to the trust. That's actually the majority of what people do. But you don't need to do it. You can hold on to a stake. Lots of people also do that. The trust needs to own the majority of shares. So there's kind of 51%, it's 49% that you can keep hold of. Whenever our clients basically tell us they're going to keep a hold of a stake, we say that's fine. Absolutely, you can do that. You make the transaction more affordable. It's a good thing. However, have a plan for what you're going to do with that stake. You should bear in mind that you are moving from a majority stake to a minority stake. And therefore, when you come to sell that stake in the future, one, you don't get the capital gains tax relief anymore. It's only once when the control passes over. But you may potentially, if you've got sophisticated trustees, get some pushback to say, actually, it's a minority stake. And actually, we don't take a dividend. We've also already got control. Your stake's not really worth very much to us. You should put some protection into the process of the EOT transaction to make sure it guards against a reduction in the value of your holding. If you are holding your stake in order to give you a future income forever, you might want to give that a lot more thought. Once you exit the business, I'm afraid the next generations may forget the contribution you've made, may forget the fact that you built the business, and start rather not wanting to pay a percentage of the profit over to you on a yearly basis. Plus, remember, it's employee owned. It is very easy to reduce the profitability, distributable profits of the business to zero by increasing profit share. Next slide, please. Can you click again? So just wanted to speak very quickly about this is the last little bit, the equity models that you may want to pass. This is your pure EOT. You have the vendors selling the business 100% to the EOT. Can you click again? And again, please. A lot of people do the pure model. It works. It's actually what RM2 has got, and it works absolutely fine. However, the hybrid model is really something which is worth considering. This is where someone else owns equity as well as the trust. Obviously, it's going to be a minority stake. This is the mechanism by which you can incentivize your next generation of directors to stay within the business. There's a characteristic of EOT transaction. The paper value of the business, when you do an EOT transaction, the paper value drops very significantly. It sounds very negative, but actually it's a fantastic opportunity to allow you to sell equity to your colleagues at a reduced value. It means the share scheme on the back of an EOT transaction can be hugely beneficial to your colleagues. They get the shares when you've been paid off. It allows them to have an enhanced profit share because they can receive dividends as well as profit share from the business as a whole. It also gives them a stake which can be sold when they leave the business. EOT transactions are not designed to give beneficiaries of the trust a capital gain. This gives an opportunity for key staff to be able to get a capital gain. It is hugely beneficial and therefore hugely incentive and motivating for colleagues to stay in businesses. Terms and conditions are attached. Yogi, that's all I want to say. I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be on one of the tables, so if you have any further questions, please let me know.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Richard, for those key considerations around become employee owned. So now we're going to introduce Giles Sirett onto stage, who is going to give you a very honest account of their journey to employee ownership.
Thank you very much, Yogi. Good morning, everybody. I've also, you'll notice on my slide there, it's not just me. I'm Giles, I'm CEO of ShapeBlue, but Alex, who is one of our cloud architects, is hanging around as well. And I thought it was a good idea to bring Alex today. You know, I led our movement to employee ownership. Alex, for the context of this call, is just a regular member of staff, obviously a highly valued member of staff. But if anybody wants to ask questions later about, you know, what this was like as from an employee's perspective, Alex is hanging around for questions. Alex, I don't know if you want to say hello quickly so people know you're not just an avatar. Maybe not. Okay. ShapeBlue. We are a highly specialist company that designs and implements cloud computing platforms, specifically infrastructure as a service platforms. We work with a huge number of very interesting customers. We've got a great customer base. And I'm very conscious for the purpose of this call today, going into any detail about actually what we do. I'll probably lose most of you within about a second. I lose most people within about a second, including people who work in the IT industry. So for the context of the limited time we've got today, effectively, we're a small professional services business with a very interesting customer list. Okay, so what we do, you could map on in terms of our business model to law firms, to accountancy firms, to other IT consultancies. In terms of just giving you a few metrics, turning over just under, should be just under 4 million this year. We are very profitable as a business. We have about 25 people, mainly non-UK, and that was interesting during our move to EO. Alex, for example, is based in Prague, been around for just over 10 years. Before we became employee owned. So are my slides actually showing, guys? Can somebody let me know? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Before we became employee owned, I owned most of the business. We'd got an existing EMI scheme for some of the leadership team. And there's a few things, I suppose, in a way are quite different to a lot of organizations. We already had an incredibly flat structure. We're an open source company. We work with open source technologies, which mean most of the people who join our organization are already enthusiasts in our space. And that was a key reason we ended up looking at employee ownership. We've grown steadily and organically over the years with no external funding after the initial seed investment. And we've always been a pretty open company. So in a way, I suppose, think back to when our journey to employee ownership started. This was going back about 2 years. My COO, who had actually worked for me in a previous organization, said, "What's the long-term plan here, Giles? You know, when we'd worked together before, we'd always been on a journey to a point, whether it was in an organization before that, we were trying to get to IPO. In the organization I worked with him, it was about getting the business ready for a trade sale. There was always something we were working towards. And to be frank, at that point, ShapeBlue was this, profitable company growing steadily that I love working in. I had no interest really to do anything. We'd received a lot of offers over the years in terms of acquisition offers because of the specialist nature of what we do. I discounted most of them simply because they wouldn't keep the company on the mission doing the things that I knew all of the staff wanted to do. And this made me think, at that stage I just turned 50. I didn't need an exit plan, but I certainly wanted a succession plan, and I wanted to make sure that the if you like, the control of the company could start to go into a broader group. And my objectives when I started thinking about this, I wanted to maintain the company mission and its culture, and avoid a hostile acquisition. Acquisition for our company effectively would have destroyed it. Any of the offers we had, the reasons people would want to acquire ShapeBlue weren't aligned with what we are currently doing at ShapeBlue. I wanted to create that clear succession plan. I wanted to realize, obviously, the equity I'd built, and I also wanted to be fair to all the staff. So they were the things that started going around in my head, and I then actually ended up in the Sunday paper one weekend, ended up reading about Richer Sounds. They're one of the poster childs of employee ownership, and that's what made me start to go on this journey of thinking, okay, maybe this is something we can do as an organization. That was spring into summer 2021. I knew nothing about employee ownership, so I set off. I think the very first thing I did was come to one of these sessions and heard somebody like me, who was a few years ahead, talking about their experience. I got to know the Employee Ownership Association, who were great in terms of introducing me to lots of other organizations where I could just have a coffee or an online chat with somebody and just find out how this thing worked in their businesses. In January 22, I put the idea to our leadership team. We then engaged advisors a couple of months later, and we had to iterate quite a few times. Then we went through a valuation process, getting to the point where our actual transaction was completed on the 24th of August 2022. It doesn't stop there. We still have work to do around the fact we're employee owned, constantly having to make sure people understand what it means to them. We decided to actually, things like our election process for trustees, our employee council, I decided that we were going to do all of that after the event, so the broader group, the staff group, could be involved in that process. During the process, we used a number of advisors, and as I mentioned earlier, the Employee Ownership Association, that's my categorization. I'm putting them into a pigeonhole there. I see the EOA as a learning and networking platform, and they were certainly invaluable when I was at that early stage. I'd read the case study of Richer Sounds. I was like, oh, how on earth could that work? So I must have spoken to 15, 20 different organizations, mainly put in touch through the Employee Ownerships Association, just to find out how it had worked for them, where it went wrong, what their problems were. And the good news is nearly everybody said, well, in fact, no, everybody said this has been a great thing for our business, but I wanted the details. When we appointed advisors, we appointed Postlethwaite, who are effectively a law firm who specialize in EMI. We'd used them previously for our EMI scheme, and they were effectively our main advisor for the purpose of the transaction. We use an organization called KLO Partners for the valuation, and our independent trustee is a guy called Sean Elliott, who was one of the people that I'd met through the Employee Ownership Association. So specific decisions you're going to have to make if you want to go EO. There's going to be lots and lots of decisions to make, but I wanted to just highlight here things that we did that are probably slightly different to other organizations. And one thing I haven't listed here, I just want to go back to what Richard was saying earlier. He said, the headline of employee ownership is the ability to sell the company tax-free. That wasn't the headline for us. Okay. I could have actually made more money by selling the business through a trade sale. As Richard said, it's the differential between what somebody is prepared to pay for your for the equity in your company versus a fair market valuation. And the suitors we had in our industry would have paid a lot more than we did through employee ownership, but it let me sleep at night. And I think for the long-term mission, it was the correct thing to do. Obviously, the fact there was a tax advantage over a normal entrepreneur relief was a nice cherry on the cake, but it probably didn't actually make up for the shortfall as if we sold the business as a trade sale. Specifically, what we did, this is a weird one, but this is all about employee ownership. It's all about openness. It's all about sharing. It's all about people having a stake in the company. The irony is, I kept the whole concept completely confidential on a need-to-know basis until completion. So Alex, for example, didn't know about this until I announced it on the 24th of August. And my logic for that was, there were potentially things that could go wrong during this process. I wanted to make sure I knew exactly how it was going to look for people before getting people excited. Then if something had got derailed, I didn't want people to then be disillusioned. We went with a 5 trustee model. So our trust is a seller, me, 1 board member who is our COO, 2 elected staff members, and an independent who's the guy I was telling you about earlier, Sean Elliott. Initially, because we were keeping this confidential, we appointed 2 staff trustees. So there was no on a short-term basis. So there was no election held initially. We did this simply because I wanted to keep it confidential. So they were interim trustees, one of whom has now been elected. The other one stepped down and somebody else has taken over. Sean, our independent trustee, we chose because he was somebody with domain experience. He was from the IT industry, and also experience of employee ownership. He had taken his own organization, Network ROI, based up in Scotland, through an employee ownership transaction. And initially, when I was looking for independent trustees, my view was we would have somebody in a suit. We would have an accountant, a lawyer, somebody to add kudos and credibility, security to the whole transaction. I spoke to a few people like that and realized they didn't really know what was going on in our business, didn't really understand it. And somebody who actually knew more about the soft elements of becoming employee owned was much more valuable. And that's a decision I'm very pleased we took. The other thing, the advisors tried to tell me we needed things like the election process, the constitution of how that's all hangs together, should all be figured out during the transaction. But I was very keen that actually our team figured that out. Because if we're going to be employee owned, they should have a contribution to that. So we left a few things like the employee council, the election process for trustees, and as a wider group, we've got together and figured those out since. What I've learnt, the actual transaction is simple. This is the 3rd business I've sold. This is by far the simplest share purchase agreement I've ever worked on. And like Richard said earlier, the reason for that is you've really only got, well, not one person, but one party. And that party is effectively, me and the other shareholders as sellers. Some the new trustees obviously have to agree, but everybody is inside the business, and one party being ShapeBlue itself. So in terms of due diligence, the level you need to go to. Yes, we did some basic due diligence, but I'm around for 5 years. I've got to face these people and explain to them why, if there are skeletons in the cupboards, why they're there. I'm still running the company. Other things I've learned: employee ownership as a concept with the trust model we're talking about today isn't an easy thing for people to grasp. It does take a few iterations to get how this works into people's head. One of the first questions was, well, we're not owners, we haven't got shares. So you have to actually make sure people understand that, individual shareholding would be hugely complicated in a business our size. The benefits should be the same. They've still got the same value, etc. But it's not as straightforward as just holding a share certificate in something. There will be cynics. Somebody on one of the calls I had said they'll split into third. You'll have a third of the people who love this concept, third of the people don't really care one way or another as long as they just get to come to work, and a third think this is all about an elaborate scam and the money's all going offshore and Giles is doing this for the wrong reasons. We're lower than a third, but there were certainly people who were cynics. Very important that everybody understands they're not becoming overnight millionaires. You might want them to become overnight millionaires, but that certainly wasn't the case here. This isn't all about the money. It's about the ongoing security of the company. It's about the security of their jobs and them being able to benefit long term. And the other thing for me is, we carry on as usual as a business. Okay, nothing has really changed as a business. On that note, there is that, I suppose in hindsight, there was some sort of fear, uncertainty and doubt in my head. This will require major changes to the business. It won't. Okay, ShapeBlue runs exactly the same way as it did the day before this transaction. The only difference is I'm not a shareholder in the business. I now effectively have a set of trustees to report to, who are the shareholders on behalf of the staff. So I have to do some more formal reporting, etc., etc. You can't run the business by committee. You're going to turn into some crazy farming co-op. No, this business is still run by its board. I'm still the CEO of this business, and people know that and want to work that way. I just have shareholders now instead of me owning the shares. And once everybody starts to get, more au fait with the numbers of the company, they'll all want a pay rise. No, most people get that we have to run the business responsibly. We've always were quite open in terms of the numbers of this company, but we were even more open now because it's their company. And certainly, with the exception of one or two people weren't like, the employees weren't like children in a sweet shop saying, hey, there's loads of money sloshing around, I want it all now. And that hasn't been the case. So finally, is it right for you? If you want a exit plan, for me, it isn't an exit plan, it's a longer term succession plan. You want to make sure your organization is passed on to a generation of people that you trust to run it, and it keeps on the same mission. And you want a relatively easy way of conducting a sale of the business. It's a no-brainer in my eyes. And then, yes, as Richard says, there is a tax advantage as well. My view is, I think for EOT to work well, you've got to be profitable. Yes, I get the idea you can go and raise external money, but I don't think Alex and the people in my team would have been happy if I'd said, right, the business is now yours and I've just saddled you with £10 million worth of debt. That is away from the spirit of it, in my opinion. And obviously, to pay the vendor loan, there's got to be money there. So if you're not a profit-making business, you're going to struggle with that. And I think, ultimately, you've got to be prepared to be open and share. That is everything from me. I'm not sure if we're doing questions now or later. Could somebody advise?
Thank you, Giles, for review there. We'll do questions later. So we've got Dan to come on and just share his experience in terms of that wealth management aspect. But yes, and just a reminder to our audience, please do pop questions into the Q&A section. So I'd like to invite Dan onto stage now.
Thank you very much, Yogi. And thank you, Giles. Good morning, everybody. My name's Daniel Sawyer. I'm one of the executive directors and client advisors here at London and Capital. We're a sort of boutique wealth and asset management firm, currently managing circa $5 billion across our group. And I lead our offering that is geared towards entrepreneurial clients, both pre and post liquidity event. Thank you. Could we click to the next slide, please? So in 6 minutes, sort of wrapping up key wealth management considerations. And what I've tried to do is split this presentation into both pre-exit event and post-exit event key considerations, sort of conceptually, and then drilling down into some of the specifics. I think the key takeaway from this slide is that in working with any client, truthfully, from a wealth management perspective, there is quite a lot of work that goes into that process prior to the point at which we're talking, quantities of stocks versus bonds that we ought to be owning in client portfolios. So this presentation is primarily centered around points 1 to 3. And if we could click to the next slide, please. So in terms of exit preparedness, conceptually, I think about this as laying the foundations of a successful transition from owner-operator to exit. One of the really nice things with an employee ownership trust transaction is that process can be a little more glacial than either a private equity or trade sale. But that said, and Richard touched on this in his presentation right at the top, actually, the importance of having a plan in your business. In my experience, most of my clients and entrepreneurial families that I work with have spent their lives developing and implementing business plans. But very rarely is the same level of consideration given to the personal side of the balance sheet. But in the most successful transitions from owner-operator to exit, generally speaking, the entrepreneur or the founder has sought out professional advice across a number of areas well in advance of an exit. And Giles touched on also seeking out conversations, sharing experiences with those who have already made the transition to employee ownership, which I think is also a key consideration. In terms of what can we be thinking about, what ought we to be thinking about in advance of an employee ownership trust transaction? Typically, an exit event will introduce greater complexity to the personal side of an individual's balance sheet. So, starting to get your head around what are the key changes in terms of tax exposures, whether that's income tax changes, inheritance tax exposure changes, as early as possible, I think is advisable. Starting also to think about what does life look like now over this 5 to 7 year deferred consideration period, any changes to lifestyle, and any changes to priorities or objectives. And from there, we can gradually start to implement either cash flow modeling or start to implement changes in terms of the structure of the personal side of the balance sheet that sort of pull in that direction of objectives and key priorities. And there, in terms of some of the specifics, we're thinking about basics, making sure that there is an up-to-date will in place that reflects your wishes, again in the context of a transaction. Starting to think about existing pension holdings, which in many cases, again post a transaction, will not be used for retirement because money purchase pensions actually fall outside of scope of inheritance tax. So very often they can be earmarked to be cascaded down to second or third generation family members post a transaction, because it will make probably more sense in most cases to derive your personal cash flow and income from the side of your balance sheet that does fall within the scope of inheritance tax. So starting to think about existing holdings and pensions in that context is advisable in the run up to a transaction. And that extends also to any existing investment holdings or policies that might have been accumulated over time, starting to think about those in a slightly different context is advisable in the run up to a transaction. So really, this is about mental preparation and harmonizing the personal side of the balance sheet in light of a forthcoming transaction. If we could flick to the next slide, please. Post-transaction implementation. Here we're into having thought about what our key priorities and objectives are. We are now thinking about ways and means of meeting those and actually implementing both structures that allow for the right level of tax mitigation, but also the right level of access and liquidity. And really, we ought to be sheltering capital from unnecessary tax exposures whilst allowing for the right level of access and liquidity. Once we've got a clear understanding of the brief, it's at that point actually that we then start to think about, well, what makes sense now in terms of investment approach that is pulling towards those specific goals and objectives. And primarily that's around making sure that there's sufficient income flows from your asset base to meet standard of living requirements. We're then into inheritance tax planning. Should we be thinking about gifting to family members or indeed philanthropy? And then just to close, I wanted to just show, if we could flick to the next slide, please, just a couple of examples of when we talk about cash flow managing, cash flow forecasting, what are we actually talking about? So this is about plugging in to a very clever software system what our advice is, the quantities of investment holdings that we're talking about allocating to individual tax wrappers, but also making some sensible conservative assumptions around both inflation and rates of growth in portfolios, and then visually forecasting that out into the future. And just to close, if we could flick to the next slide, please, Yogi. Many thanks. So here, what we're showing here, right away along the bottom axis is time and capital on the left-hand side. So what we're showing, and each of these bars representing 1 year. So what we're showing here is the deferred consideration, which is represented in the purple bars, being received over a period of time. The black line that runs along the very top of these bars is an expenses line. So below that is, lifestyle requirements, tax, any capital expenditures, essentially. And the fact that the bars are full in different shades of blue will show where that cash flow is coming from, which I think is a really useful exercise, again, in the context of a liquidity event. Forecasting this far out into the future without a tool of this nature can be really pretty tough. So we do recommend, and although this may change over time and evolve over time, we do recommend cash flow modelling as a quite an important part of just getting your head around what this means personally from a financial perspective. Thank you very much. And also hosting one of the breakout tables. So delighted to expand on any of these points and answer any questions at the close. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It was really interesting in terms of, we're always talking about businesses preparing themselves financially, but to actually consider the preparedness from a personal perspective financially, both before and after the transition. I think it was really insightful. Thank you. So I'm actually now going to invite all of our other speakers back on stage, and we're going to go through a bit of a Q&A. We have got questions coming in thick and fast. So wait for Giles. Okay, so I'm going to get stuck into the questions that are coming in from our audience. One very popular is one for you, Richard. So this is about the paper value of the shares. So can you elaborate a little more on how the paper value of the shares will drop in an EOT process, which makes it a great opportunity to sell shares to key staff?
Yeah, so effectively, you have agreed a valuation. You've agreed a price that the business is going to be sold at. Sold to the EOT, assuming, let's just for simpleness, let's say it's all been done by vendor debt. As soon as the transaction takes place, there is a obligation for the company to pay that particular debt. It's not on the balance sheet of the company, but there is the obligation there. A future valuation, i.e. the day after the transaction, your value would say, well, your business was worth, 5 million quid, but now it owes £5 million to the previous shareholders. this business is not worth a great deal. That's probably the easiest way I can explain it. Putting a share scheme together, which can take advantage of that, is not 100% straightforward. You need a specialist share scheme person used to doing share schemes on the back of EOTs in order to take advantage of that benefit. But it does work, and it's kind of just economics. It's a paper reduction in value. It doesn't make any difference to the business. It has no effect on your credit rating or anything like that.
Okay, so seek specialist advice if that's what you're looking to do. Okay, Giles. Well, actually, this question might be both for Richard and Giles from what you can do and what's worked in practice. We've got a question here that asks who appoints the board of a trust. So, Richard, if you can kind of share best practice from that perspective, and Giles, if you could talk to your experience of that.
Practicalities of it. The initial board of trustee directors is appointed by the vendors. But they may choose to, if they're having someone like an employee representative on that, they may sort of have a mechanism for doing a vote or what have you. Once the trustee is in place, it is independent from the company, and what should happen is that the trustees appoint their future members, albeit that if a mechanism as for a voting of an employee representative, that should really still continue. But even if the trustees have complete control of their appointments, I would suggest a trustee doing their job properly would probably consult the board of the company before they appoint a new trustee. That's my opinion.
Okay.
So I think the short answer is you can make this work however you want. Ultimately, it all comes down to what goes in your trust deed. I didn't cover any of this because I didn't have time, but that's what the advisors will advise you on. We chose a mechanism, and this is all hard coded now into our trust deed. We chose a mechanism where there was one vendor, me. There was one representative from the company, that's another board member, happens to be our COO, and then we have an equilibrium, if you like, where I was very keen we had two elected employee trustees. If we're going to be 100% employee owned, I want them to know this is not just something that Giles has cooked up, that they're not really in control. So there's a balance there, and by having that balance, it meant we actually had to have an independent because potentially we needed a referee. I mean, that hasn't happened. I hope it never will, but we needed somebody. So, but you can make that different. It's up to you as an organization in terms of, how much power you want to try and hold on to versus how equitable you want to make this for your employees.
Okay, and actually one of the questions we have had as well is about the number of trustees. So Giles, you said you've got 5 to have that kind of voting balance. Richard, any kind of best practice from yourself in terms of the number of trustees?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I'm swayed slightly by my personal preferences. I always kind of think boards, committees, they actually work more efficiently as there's less people on it. But taking into account what Giles has said, if you're setting up your trustees particularly to give a message that actually this is a genuine, we want employee contribution to this process, then having a larger number in order to accommodate employee representatives or whatever mix of trustees you want, you do what is right for your business. You vary it depending on the business.
And I think the other thing there, we had the 2 sides and the referee. We could have gone with a 3-person board, right? Me, somebody from the staff, and an independent. The reason we went 5 was to remove the single point of failure of always, especially with people being elected, right? You've got no proof that being an employee trustee is a big responsibility, and we put all our people through the training courses on that because they've never seen a balance sheet. They don't know how this works. They don't know the right questions to ask. So it's a responsibility. So what we wanted to avoid is somebody might get elected who really struggles with this. And then we've got a process until the next election. We've got a situation where we've got somebody who's really not representing the shareholders, the staff. They're really not asking me the right questions. So by having 2 from each side, we felt that just gave us that redundancy.
Yeah. And
Can I just add, actually, it's really, if you're putting, just to sort of go on from what Giles was saying, it's really sensible. Whoever you bring in, you need a really good idea of what the role and responsibility of the trusts within that business is. So that if you bring somebody in who's not got sort of board experience and what have you, you can actually point them and say, this is your role. What you don't want to do is bring someone on who thinks that part of their role is to bring issues or questions from individual employees. Trustees are making decisions in the best interests of the beneficiaries, the employees as a whole, the whole body of the beneficiaries, not as individual grievances and what have you.
And that's bang on, Richard. And that was one of the biggest things it took us to get over to people when we announced this. And I ended up using a really extreme example, right, which was in our trust deed. If we want to start making redundancies, we have no plans to, Alex, by the way, if you're listening in. We you know, things go south, we need to lose some headcounts. Now the board have executive power to do that, but our trust deed says that we need to consult with the trustees over that. Fair enough. But you need somebody there as an employee trustee who's in the situation, who is prepared to realize that you need to let people go in order for the best interests of the trustees. That's the most extreme. I mean, I think John Lewis have had that situation in the last year, but you really do need people who are going to realize, you know, I'm representing a group of shareholders here. I'm not here necessarily as an employee to talk about, you know, what type of coffee we get at break time and that sort of stuff.
yeah. And we do see that. I think it's really important that the individual that is an employee trustee has those skills, knowledge, and the confidence to go into that role and represent the trust. Just I'm going to keep on the note of governance. Just one last question around the kind of board and the trust makeup. So we've had a question from a couple of people saying, is it a requirement to have an external independent trustee? Giles, you mentioned what you were looking for in that independent trustee. It'd be good to get kind of your experience of how that's helped. And Richard, I guess from you as well, to say, is it a requirement, or is it a best practice?
I don't think there's any legal requirement to do so. Richard would probably be better positioned to answer that. It was a no-brainer for us because of our the way we wanted to constitute our board of trustees. But no, I don't. We've said employee trustees stand for X number of years. We've chosen with a board appoints one, the seller. You can make that whatever you want. Yeah, that's a blank sheet of paper. As long as it gets written into the trustee and accepted, and not just accepted legally during the transaction, accepted by all the staff culturally, that this is a good way to sort of govern the company, I think you can write whatever you want in there. Yeah, Richard, am I correct there?
Yeah. So EOTs are governed by EOT legislation, and it's completely and utterly silent on who your trustee should be. So there is no requirement for an independent trustee. Smaller companies don't tend to have them because it's just an additional cost. It's an additional bit of housekeeping to keep on board. But they can be very good. There are an increasing number of specialist EOT trustees because not only do they give that kind of independent view, but also if they're specialist EOT trustees, they should have a very good knowledge of how EOT-owned businesses should work, so they can advise from within as part of their role as being a trustee.
Okay. So I'm very conscious about time. There's lots of other questions coming in. We'll take maybe a couple more, and we'll do a couple of quick fire rounds before we move on to the networking. One for you, Giles. If you were to do this again, is there anything that you would do differently?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that question. My PC went to sleep, funny enough. Don't know
If you were to do the kind of transition process again, is there anything you would do differently, having kind of been through the process?
Overall, no. There's a couple of things I might want to revisit. I think I've made the point. I went the route of on a need-to-know basis, which did have advantages. What it did mean was at the point of announcing it, it came as an absolute shock to people, and therefore the education, communicating what this means to people had to be quite an intense process. I think, if we'd drip fed some of these ideas into people and told them to do some research, or even done a bit of a consultation asking people, that might have helped overcome that. But it also did have the advantage that, again, with our flat structure, if we start to do that, everybody will have a view on how this should look. And to a certain extent, that transaction, you have to drive it through like any other transaction. You can't do that by committee, in my opinion. So that's probably only the only thing I'd do differently. We actually had to do I don't know the legal term for it is, a non-corporate trust initially, because we'd had some overspill from some of our EMI stuff. We would like to have done a corporate trust from the outset, which is something we're going to move to next year. But that's a technical detail.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. I think this might be for either Richard or Dan. Can a shareholder receive the tax-free payment for his shares or her shares and a paycheck whilst overseeing the transition?
Sorry, can they be paid consideration for the transaction and receive PAYE payments? Is that the question?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, I would say that slightly going into a sort of bit of a grey area here. I mean, a HMRC would expect them to be paid via payroll. Obviously, the more that previous owners and current directors are paying themselves via payroll, the less profit that's being generated that could be paid for them as consideration, which would be coming out gross, tax-free, etc., etc. You can work out the conflict there yourselves.
Yeah, just to expand on that slightly.
Dan, is there anything from yourself that?
Yeah. I was just going to say, I have had an example actually of a client who had sold their business to an employee ownership trust, and then attempted to stipulate that they did not want to continue to draw a salary for the business, which turned out not to be possible. I think it's a requirement actually that you continue to draw a salary of some kind from the business during that transitional period. So yes, that's far more typical.
I think HMRC would like to get you to think that it's a requirement. I think it's actually. I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. It's quite a grey area.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring kind of the Q&A session to a close now. But thank you very much for all the input and answering the questions. And I know there's lots of questions that have been unanswered. So now is the opportunity for those who are sitting in the audience, having listened to this, is to move into our networking area and go and join Richard, Giles, Dan, and I believe Alex will be there as well, and Sarah. There's lots of different tables. Go and have a chat. We would encourage you to move tables. No one's going to think it's rude. I know it's a very British thing to want to stay, but if you've had your question answered or you've heard some insight, move on and have a chat to other people. There will also be members of the EOA team. I'm actually going to be on a table talking about our EO Learn courses as well, if you want to come and have a chat to me. And we'll be in the networking area for about 20-25 minutes. So go and have a chat, and then we'll bring you all back just to do a bit of a wrap up. But again, thank you very much for our guest speakers, and see some of you in the networking area. Welcome back. I hope you had some great conversations and managed to get a few more of your questions answered during that networking session. I just want to wrap up, say thank you again to our guest speakers, Richard, Giles and Dan. It was really interesting hearing those comments and your insight. Certainly things I hope you're taking away from today is that seek advice where possible, have a plan. I think that's something I took away, including succession. and that personal preparedness, not just mentally in terms of a business owner going into employee ownership, but actually what you're going to do afterwards as well. And talk to others, learn, come along to more of these sessions. It's a really good opportunity to connect and network in with the EO sector. And lastly, manage your comms around employees, some of those expectations. Yeah, no one size fits all. That's one thing I always say about employee ownership. It really is about what's driving your business and what your values, your culture, and what your objectives are. Anyway, so what I will say though is that our session has been recorded today, so you will get an opportunity to connect back in with if the session if you want to listen to something again. It is hosted on our EO Hub and will be sent out as a wrap up in an email. And the only thing that's left for me to say now is if you could spend a couple of minutes giving us some feedback on this session. It's really important to us to know and understand how we can make these sessions as valuable to you guys as possible. And if there's any changes that we can make or if there's any enhancements, we'd love to hear about it. So there will be a link popped in the chat. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill out that would be fantastic. Okay, so again, thank you very much to our speakers, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.